Chapter 9, 1986. I drove west while Janet and Brendan played in the camper. I was pensive because things with Andy were so strained. I couldn't figure out what was wrong and why my relationship with him was fraying. I loved the man I remembered and hated the depressed, angry, sleep-deprived reality I'd just left. Every week I'd phone Andy to let him know how we were and how much money I was sending him so he could plan the house truck construction. One day when I called, he told me George had passed away. "Michelle, I'm going to San Francisco for a bit and I won't be here when you get home. Roger has some unfinished work and he wants to hire me to help him. I figured the money would be good since the art shows were mediocre." I knew Andy was at peace in his relationship with his dad, and it was no surprise George had died, probably a blessing for him to be out of pain. Even so, I thought it was better for Andy to spend some time with his brother than be alone with his loss. I was a bit relieved to be going home and not immediately having to face the absence of our happy marriage. When I was away from Andy, I remembered all that I loved about him, and I missed our friendship desperately. He had started blaming me for every bad thing that happened. I realized now that he had lost himself in depression and the discomfort in his own body, and blaming me was the only outlet he knew. I think his lashing out was a desperate attempt to free himself of an illness we didn't understand or even know what to call. I'd waver between believing I should end our marriage and knowing I wasn't to blame, and if I could only bear the pain, I could possibly help him through this, and we could return to our happy marriage. It was a hard position to be in. We returned to Taos, and Andy was gone. I felt relief living with only 3-year-old Brendan, who was a joyful, kind, and loving child. It was November, and my family from Chicago had planned a Thanksgiving reunion in Snowmass, Colorado. Since Andy was busy working in San Francisco, Brendan and I drove up to be with them. My grandmother Nana was there, along with my parents, siblings, and their significant others. Nana lent us stability to the vacation as she always stayed at the house and waved goodbye or welcomed us back, depending on which way we were going. My brother Tom and his wife Jenny had their 8-month-old baby daughter, Kate, with them. She was a smiley, content baby, and I held her as often as I could. For the first time since Brendan had been born, I had an inkling of desire to have another child. What odd timing, I thought to myself as I bounced sweet Kate on my lap, and she'd giggle and meet my gaze with her big blue eyes. Brendan and I went skiing with everybody at Aspen Highlands, the same place Andy and I had met and fallen in love. It was a lot of fun to ski there with Brendan, and it felt strange not having Andy with us. I had to remind myself about all the problems we'd been having because being away put them out of my mind. One evening at the house, I was called to the phone. It was Andy. "I want to talk and have you just listen, okay?" he asked. I agreed. "When you and Brendan left to continue doing shows with Janet, you threw a book at me." "Uh-oh," I thought. "Well," he continued, "I picked up the book and started reading it. There's a test at the beginning, and I took it, and I got 100%, which means I had a raging case of Candida in my body. I had all the symptoms of the illness, and this book, The Yeast Connection, gave me a way to cure it. I've been taking the supplements the author recommended, and I've completely changed my diet. I stopped drinking juice or alcohol, stopped eating sugar, bread, mushrooms, cheese, soy sauce, and anything fermented. I went through a week or two of worsening symptoms, but that suffering was lessened because I knew this die-off period was a step in the right direction toward healing." Can't imagine, I thought. "But now," he went on, "I'm beginning to feel like myself again. I'm beginning to feel happy again. I love you and Brendan more than I have words for, and I'm hoping you'll give me another chance." I was quiet as I absorbed all this. "I know it's been really hard," he said. "It's been hard on all of us, but I never knew what to do about it until now. I am a new man because my health is returning." I was quiet, and now he was too, as the phone kept us connected, and in the silence I started to cry. All the bad memories and fears and pain came flooding over me, and I wondered if I could trust this. "If you need to think about it, that's all right," Andy said. "I want to be in San Francisco a bit longer because Roger has more work for me, and there's a lot of stuff to go through from George's apartment. I'm hoping you and Brendan would drive to Grand Junction in a few days, pick me up at the airport, and we'll drive together back to San Francisco. Perhaps we can begin again." "Andy, I don't need to think about it," I said. "Of course I'll give you another chance." He booked a flight, and we met a few days later in Colorado, starting the long drive to San Francisco. Across the desert, we fell in love again. Brendan re-met the father he loved, who had not been available for a long time. Brendan was curious about how the world worked and why the sky was blue and all those questions 3-year-olds have, and now Andy could answer them all with his deep knowledge. Brendan's childlike need for closeness and acceptance was now filled with snuggles and smiles from his dad. Andy really seemed to be back to the guy I knew and loved. It was hard to believe the difference. That night, with our camper parked in the desert under a cloudy sky with vast winds that shook us, we became lovers again. Brendan celebrated his 4th birthday while we were in San Francisco, and we had a celebration in our camper. This was a happy time for us as we trusted that Andy's health was indeed returning. Sometimes he'd feel upset about something or another, but instead of feeling rage and blame, he'd respond with simple frustration and natural disappointment. That was the beginning of me being able to trust him again. His diet was plain to an extreme, but he stuck with it because it brought him the ability to be himself again. It turned out that he had missed his true self as much as Brendan and I had. The illnesses that affect one's psyche are tricky because they can take away a person's intrinsic nature, and coping mechanisms can become their identity. When we lived in Hawaii, we had a problem with mice in our house. We set glue traps for them and found them dead in the morning. I worried about the mice suffering a painful death after being caught. Mice are meek creatures and usually die quickly when they find no way out. It is nature's way of easing suffering, Andy said. I thought about how human beings are generally not meek. We don't simply die when we get stuck, we cope. Some coping mechanisms are gentler and more tolerable than others, but we don't live in a society that teaches us to differentiate between a person's true self and the coping mechanisms they adopt in order to survive their sickness. These coping mechanisms include addiction, anger, rage, blame, shame, and violence. Most people know that somewhere in that quagmire exists a spark of light representing the true self that lies buried beneath. When Andy got sick with Candida, we tried to cure it in every way we knew. For years, we couldn't even name it, and that led to us to question the validity of the illness altogether. We'd used up our resources, both financial and emotional, trying to help him feel better, and until he read The Yeast Connection, nothing had helped. One of his coping mechanisms had been blaming me for everything gone wrong. I'd been sick of feeling like the cause of all his problems. I used to flinch every time a problem came up. I'd tiptoe in the morning, trying to keep Brendan silent until we could get out of Andy's space. Time and again, I'd do his work when Andy was crying and unable to get out of bed, and I'd sell at the art show by myself. We had tried so hard to discover what the sickness was and were fatigued almost to the point of ending our relationship when that book came flying into our lives. Finding the name for Andy's illness empowered us, as knowing names for things often does. After we learned a cure and were able to work toward it, the wide separation that had grown between us was eliminated. I was able to fully understand that none of Andy's problems were my fault. By the time Brendan and I returned to him, the heavy clouds of confusion and the actual pain and suffering he'd lived with for years had lifted. Life went on. Back in Taos, Andy worked building our house truck, and Brendan started going to a small preschool. One morning, I was on a run and was cruising down a hill when I suddenly felt an awareness that I was not alone. I recognized the feeling, and I knew I was pregnant again. The spirit of this child was that strong, and I was stunned. I felt enormous joy and wanted to celebrate, but also knew that my happy marriage lay in a delicate balance as Andy continued to heal from his long, debilitating sickness. Toward the end of my run, I committed myself to being a mother to a second child, no matter what happened with Andy and our marriage and his health. Then I went inside and told Andy, and it was his turn to be stunned. He had always loved Brendan, was devoted to him forever, but to have another child now, before much time of being well had occurred, naturally brought up fear. That evening we told Brendan, and our wild and wonderful boy did a full-out happy dance, complete with whoops and hollers of celebration. "I'm finally going to be a big brother," he shouted. He looked at his dad. "I don't know what's wrong with you, Andy, but you need to get happy about this." That brought a smile to Andy's face, and that smile made me know this baby brought new possibilities to all of us. Every aspect of life was more fun with Brendan around. He loved the story of Robin Hood. He'd often assign us roles to play from the story while skiing or doing errands in town. He was not attached to the role of Robin. Many times he was Little John or one of the merry men. It didn't seem to matter to him, but I was usually Maid Marian and began to answer to that name. "Maid Marian is having a baby," he'd say while smiling at me. Brennan came with me to the appointments with our midwives, and he was totally absorbed in following the development of the new baby and loved to listen to the heartbeat and feel movements in my belly with his small hand. We chose not to find out the sex of the new baby. "Can we name our new baby Robin Hood?" Brendan asked one morning. Auntie and I both liked the name Robin for a boy or a girl, but we were not enthusiastic about the hood part. We told Brennan that Robin could be a possibility. We skied together a lot that winter. Andy continued to be stronger and happier. Becoming a family of 4 was something we all shared excitement about now. We hiked Kachina Peak numerous times, and Brendan hiked it too, this time without being carried. We made jewelry and entered art shows for the summer and lived in our rental house on Ski Valley Road as happily as could be. We wanted to have a home birth, and our midwives approved. The house we were renting had a peaceful garden with an acequia or irrigation waterway running through it that drew lots of hummingbirds and dragonflies. Early on the morning of August 19th, my water broke. The baby's due date wasn't until September 6th, almost 3 weeks later, and our midwives were a bit concerned. They checked me out, and since all seemed well, they told me to just be active physically to try to trigger labor. On August 20th, I walked in the light of the sunrise, pacing back and forth on the dirt road in front of our house. Andy made breakfast for Brendan, and Janet came over. During labor, Brendan calmly tapped our midwife's shoulder. "Would you move over just a little? I can't see." "You have a beautiful, wet, blonde daughter," the midwife exclaimed as I took her into my arms. She kept her eyes closed in the bright sunlit room. Shortly after, Brendan and Andy held her. "Is her name Robin Hood?" Brendan asked. "We're going with Robin Alana," Andy said. "We'll call her Alana." Brendan loved that and loved her. "This little baby can be one of your very best friends ever," Andy told Brendan, "or she could not be. And right now, it's all up to you because she's only a baby." Brendan chose then and there to be the best big brother ever. 2 weeks later, I flew with Alana to the East Coast to do an art show in Williamsburg, Virginia. I was nervous to do this trip with such a young baby and no help. It worked out better than I could have imagined. My booth was mobbed with people. I couldn't see past my own booth because more and more people surrounded me. It was intense, loud, and wonderful. I had no chance to count money because it was all I could do to keep collecting it and replenishing my stock of bracelets and earrings. The windfall of money helped us enormously in our plan to move back to Hawaii. We decided having 2 small kids in a warm climate was a better choice than a high-altitude winter climate, and we knew we could make jewelry anywhere. We packed up our belongings and prepared to move out of our perfect home birth house. Andy had completed the work on our house truck and moved it onto our friend's land nearby. Our plan was for me to fly with our kids to Chicago and spend some time with my family, while Andy flew to Hawaii to find us a place to live.